concern over Russian airstrikes isn't just about international power politics.
Vladimir Putin is killing civilians to shore up his ally President Assad.
Doctors Without Borders accuse U.S. forces of deliberately bombing that hospital in Kunduz city.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert. You're at The Listening Post, and these are some of the media stories that we're tracking this week. Journalists reporting on Syria, a multifaceted, multi-layered story, now have a Russian angle to cover. Turkey, a columnist gets beaten up. His paper's owners are under investigation, and protesters long for better days. How do news outlets in India and Pakistan cover one of the world's most sensitive bilateral relationships? The answer is not very well. And 2 years in the making, a time-lapse look at Austria. When Russian warplanes recently entered Syrian airspace and started dropping their payloads, the global media had plenty of questions to ask. Where did the bombs fall? What were the targets? And were civilians among those killed? The Kremlin's position was scrutinized, not necessarily on Russian news channels, where criticizing the government has proven to be a bad career move. The scrutiny came from further to the West, including media outlets in the U.S. like CNN and the New York Times, which is interesting, since that channel and that newspaper had another story to cover this past week, the bombing of a Medecins Sans Frontieres hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, by an American gunship, in which more than 20 people were killed. The approach that CNN and the Times took to that story, the terminology and the timeline of their coverage, revealed much about the cautious way that the U.S. media cover their own warplanes compared to the zeal that they bring when they report on the military other. This is a media story with multiple datelines, Washington, Moscow, and Afghanistan among them. But our starting point this week is Syria. The weather forecast for Syria delivered from Moscow on the state-owned news channel Rossiya 24. Partly cloudy with a chance of collateral damage.
В Сирии продолжается операция российских воздушно-космических сил. Как отмечают эксперты, время для нее с точки зрения погоды выбрано очень удачно.
Well, this is part of the whole Russian propaganda and Russia's war on terror. Crazy statements like, oh, this weather is great for airstrikes without, talking about what's going on the ground.
Октябрь в Сирии в целом благоприятный для полетов в месяц. Средняя скорость ветра 2-4.
The mainstream media, of course, they try to support this move and they see it as a positive for Russia. And one of the main arguments is that it's better to fight terrorists abroad than at home. There is another reason that Russia does not want to lose its positions in the Middle East. Also, I wouldn't say that 100% of media has this approach. They argue that it could backfire to Russia, that the risk of conducting terror attacks in Russia by ISIS can increase significantly. So there are several views on that, but the dominant, I would say, is supportive to airstrikes in Syria.
If you watch Russian TV, they've taken a chapter out of the American war on terror. Everything now is about Russia's war on terror in Syria, where the coalition has failed, and now comes Russia, and Russia will save the day.
Что Россия уже в 4-й раз спасает ее от порабощения или варварства. Считаем: монголы, Наполеон, Гитлер, теперь ИГИЛ.
We've seen jingoism from the Russian media in recent days. We've seen jingoism in American media, in British media, Australian media, Canadian media as well.
When we go to war, we don't want a fair fight. Our military commanders should be allowed to throw everything they have at the enemy.
The use of a brimstone missile showed power and precision.
When Britain recently carried out a unilateral targeted assassination in Syria, our main daily paper here carried a headline, wham, bam, thank you, Cam. Cam being the Prime Minister. I mean, the tabloids here went absolutely crazy. We are in a particularly challenging time for reporters where war is seen as the first option rather than the last.
To assess the Western media coverage of the Russian bombing campaign, it is helpful to look back at the coverage from just over a year ago.
As the moon moves into a new phase, so does the war against ISIS.
When a coalition led by the U.S. and including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the Gulf states began hitting ISIL targets from the air.
9 p.m., U.S. airstrikes light up the night sky over Raqqa.
Since then, times, terminology, and the tone of coverage have all changed.
When Russia bombs in Syria, or other parties are bombing, suddenly the media are concerned with the inaccuracy of the bombing. But when the U.S., which has for the past year waged airstrikes against ISIS, there's not much concern for civilian casualties and inaccuracy.
The desert bloomed with fireballs.
Bombing is inherently indiscriminate, and when media only point that indiscriminate nature out about certain agents, that's an act of hypocritical bias.
And the main narrative here, I think, is that the hypocrisy with which the United States conducts its policy. On the one hand, it conducts airstrikes itself abroad, and in the majority of cases, civilian casualties, what's called collateral damage. And on the other hand, the United States started from the first day, even from the first hours of Russian operation in Syria, to blame it for civilian casualties.
And anyone paying attention to U.S. media output this past week would have spotted another example of different standards applied to similar stories. When American forces repeatedly bombed a hospital in Afghanistan, killing a minimum of 22 people, headline writers at CNN and the New York Times tied themselves into editorial knots. It is not easy to report such a story without saying who was responsible, but they tried. And we tried to get their response to their critics, but neither organization replied.
The New York Times headline, for instance, said something to the effect of, U.S. is blamed for Afghan hospital bombing. Well, why was the U.S. blamed? The U.S. was blamed because the U.S. bombed the hospital. But there's a lot of obfuscation going on. When it's Russia behind bombings, the media instantly jump to reporting that civilians have been killed without confirming those facts as thoroughly.
Commanders of the Syrian Free Army have said that Russian bombing has caused civilian casualties.
And how the American media behaved to take basically the talking points of the Pentagon in the first 24 hours and put that out on the air, casting doubt and coming out with ambiguous reports. And you could see that in the headlines of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the early reports from CNN that there was an airstrike, but we are not sure if it was done by the Americans. If the Americans didn't do it, who did it?
And that's a pattern, I'm afraid. We find particularly CNN, New York Times, Washington Post seem unwilling to grapple with this issue of civilian casualties. Often their defense is, we don't have enough information, we don't know who to trust. Well, find the people to trust. Use your pretty significant resources to carry out investigations. It's not impossible. We're a tiny monitoring organization, and we have tracked hundreds of allegations of civilian fatalities caused by the US-led coalition. We can do it. They certainly can.
In the first wave of strikes. But the question is not whether the U.S. media can do that kind of reporting. It is a question of will. Given the pressure the Kremlin exerts upon the Russian media, they too lack the will. Journalistic conditions in the two countries are clearly not the same. Neither is the output, but the similarities are inescapable. You could call it a coalition of the unwilling.
On the download, our viewers on the news coverage of the story in Syria.
There are several narratives emerging from the coverage of the airstrikes by the Russian media. The first one is the idea of the Islamic State presenting a real danger to Russian security in the long term and therefore being a legitimate target for Russian airstrikes. The second narrative is the use of high-tech weapons in Syria by the Russian Air Force, so the stress is on effectiveness, the civilian casualties are usually not mentioned.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. Turkey has a general election coming up. Its conflict in the southeast with the Kurdish movement is burgeoning, and many journalists in the country are feeling the pressure. On October 1st, Ahmed Hakan, a columnist for Turkey's Hürriyet newspaper and the host of his own program on CNN Turk, was beaten outside his home in Istanbul by 4 men and then hospitalized. Just last month, columnist Cem Küçük issued a warning to Hakan in the pro-government newspaper Daily Star. He wrote, "We will crush you like a bug if we so wish. It's only because we've been merciful until now that you are still alive." Last month, Hürriyet's offices in Istanbul were attacked by pro-government supporters unhappy with the secular paper's coverage of the ruling AK party, accusing it of supporting the banned Kurdish party, the PKK. Prosecutors have since launched an investigation into the paper's owner, Doğan Media Group, for alleged terrorism propaganda. On the 4th of October, a video posted online showed Turkish forces in the Diyarbakir region manhandling 2 journalists at gunpoint. The reporter Serhat Yüce works for DİHA, a Kurdish news agency. The cameraman Kamil Murat Demirish is with Özgür Gun TV, another Kurdish outlet. This past week, hundreds of journalists marched in Istanbul under the banner "Free Media Cannot Be Silenced." Last week, we reported on an episode on the West Bank in which 2 journalists working for Agence France-Presse were assaulted by Israeli soldiers, their equipment destroyed. This past week, another reporter suffered facial injuries while covering clashes between Israeli police and Palestinian protesters in East Jerusalem. Within hours, she was back on the air. Hannah Mahamid is an Israeli Arab reporter with the Lebanon-based Al Mayadeen TV. She was going live covering an outbreak of fighting in East Jerusalem when she was wounded by a stun grenade thrown by Israeli police. The injuries appeared to be serious, but Mahamid was back on the air that same day.
هذا الوجه يعني الذي أظهر به الآن على شاشة الميادين هو صورة واحدة من يعني صور الانتهاكات الإسرائيلية للفلسطيني عموما.
Some reports have since suggested that Mahamid might have been pressed to go back on the air for reasons that were in part logistical. It is not easy for Arab news outlets to get their journalists accredited by Israeli authorities, and getting a replacement into Jerusalem on such short notice would have proved challenging. Israeli police say that they used riot dispersal means to clear the area, and that whoever is present with law-breaking rioters risks getting injured. Security forces in Somalia have shut down a privately owned television channel and arrested 2 of its journalists. Awil Dahir Salad, a presenter on Universal TV, and the channel's East Africa director, Abdullah Hersi, were arrested October 2nd. The channel was raided after Dahir Salad interviewed 2 members of parliament about foreign troops brought into Somalia to help quell the al-Shabaab movement. The Somali Minister for Information said Universal TV has been repeatedly warned by the security forces to stop the anti-government propaganda, which they ignored. This is not the first time a media outlet has been shut down in Somalia. Last year, the authorities raided the offices of Radio Shabelle and arrested several staff members. It has been almost 70 years since India was partitioned to create the independent republics of India and Pakistan. The British pulled out, and they left behind 2 countries, 2 populations, as well as a Pandora's box of geopolitical tensions in South Asia. Since then, India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars, accused each other of terrorist attacks, and battled over Kashmir. And the tensions are reflected in the news media. On the Indian airwaves, Pakistan is often characterized as a terrorist state, while on Pakistani news channels, suspicions of an Indian Hindu agenda underlie nearly all political discourse on the country. The media are also a casualty of the tension. Since 2014, there have been no Indian journalists based in Pakistan. It's been even longer since Pakistani reporters have been based in India. The airwaves of both countries are jam-packed with channels whose output sometimes amplifies the bilateral tension. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on cross-border coverage on the Indian subcontinent.
This was set to be an eventful year for India and Pakistan. After long negotiations, the 2 countries had agreed to hold talks between their national security advisors in August, the first formal talks in 3 years. But before it even began, the question of Kashmir came up and derailed plans.
कश्मीरियों को अलग रखने की शर्त लगाकर भारत मुज़ाकरात से भाग गया
The talks were off and media in both countries reverted to type.
पाकिस्तान की अक्ल पर एटम बम पड़ गया है क्या?
Both medias tend to be generally hostile. Neither side is prepared to accept that they may be at fault. And the interesting thing is that both medias are broadly inclined to accept the point of view of the national security establishment.
There was a very hostile press in India. I'll give you an example. There is a very popular channel, very jingoistic channel.
You are trying to sabotage the talks. It's self-evident to everyone tonight.
What they were doing was that they turned it into a kind of a boxing match.
Talking to them is giving them a cloak of respectability.
This is not a tone of journalism. It's very naive, it's very immature, and it's pointlessly hostile.
In Pakistan, the narrative is about the enemy country, and they use a particular Urdu phrase which is called Dushman Hamsaya.
हमारे सामने वाली सरहद पर हम जानते हैं दुश्मन रहता है.
This is used very often in Pakistani media. Both sides have taken the position that the other is a hostile.
There's been an unwritten rule since the 90s. India will only ever accredit 2 journalists from Pakistan and vice versa. In 2011, Radio Pakistan withdrew its correspondent from New Delhi, citing high costs. And then last year, the 2 Indian journalists working in Pakistan were sent home. Their visa extensions refused without explanation. The situation has meant media outlets in both countries staff their cross-border operations with locals.
There is an argument that, well, we can just link them up to a camera and have a conversation from a studio in New Delhi.
लेफ्टिनेंट कर्नल रिटायर्ड शफकत सईद रक्षा विशेषज्ञ पाकिस्तान से हमारे साथ हैं.
But I can say from my experience of having been there that it's not the conversations that you have for 10 minutes over a video link. It is actually living among Pakistanis, being with them in their marriages, in their deaths, in their births, in their festivals. These are nuances that you get, I think, only when you go to that place.
See, I am not very sure that the placing of Indian correspondents in Pakistan or the Pakistani correspondents in India is a solution. The problem is the system on both sides is controlled by intelligence agencies. They make life miserable for you.
When there have been big events in Pakistan in the last few years, whether it was elections before that, whether it was the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, and even today when there's a bomb blast in Pakistan, Indian media will turn to their colleagues across the border to get their reportage for Indian channels. Pakistani media will often call us up and ask us for our assessment of an Indian story. So there is that level of trust between Indian and Pakistani media. Where that trust does not exist is really when it comes to India-Pakistan relations themselves, and they have gotten worse.
There are journalists who try to break the narrative mold on stories like Kashmir, terrorism and cross-border issues. As the security talks were crumbling in August, 2 channels on opposite sides of the divide covered the story in a different way. Together.
आज हम बात करेंगे पाकिस्तान और भारत के जो नेशनल सिक्योरिटी एडवाइजर्स हैं.
From Islamabad, the Urdu channel Geo News broadcast a show hosted simultaneously from New Delhi by an anchor from the Hindi channel Aaj Tak.
कि दरअसल इस्लामाबाद का रास्ता दिल्ली आता है, लेकिन वो कश्मीर होकर क्यों आना चाहता है?
The host from one side asked questions of the panel on the other. Anywhere else, this would be common sense journalism. But in the India-Pakistan context, it was extraordinary in that it was so civilized.
They were both sides of the story sitting in one story, and it was pieced together across the border. So I think there was a lot of intrinsic value to the effort that went into bringing this program together. Quality of debate, frankly, again, it was binary. It was really like the proverbial twains that shall never meet.
वो जो करारदाद वहाँ पे पास हुई, क्या वो कहती है कि कश्मीर जो है भारत का एक integral part है?
I've been covering the India-Pakistan relationship for 20 years now, and it has always been difficult, simply because there isn't a common understanding of anything between India and Pakistan. There isn't a common understanding of history. There isn't a common understanding of agreements that both sides have signed, even if they are in black and white.
Complicating the coverage is the fact that both Indian and Pakistani media have seen explosive growth in the last couple of decades. In India, the growth began in the 90s, and now there are nearly 100 news channels in the country. Pakistan's media has grown from a single state broadcaster in 2000 to dozens of channels today. Many of them broadcast Bollywood films to Pakistani audiences. But news output from India is banned, and on Pakistani news channels, the focus on their neighbor has never been as sharp as it is from across the border.
Is this greater anxiety from Pakistan this year linked to India's power push?
Pakistan is the bête noire of the Indian media. It's as though there is a wound deep down in the Indian psyche that they have not yet been able to come to terms with, and that the memory and the scar of that wound is passed on from generation to generation.
The swings in Pakistani media perspective on India are really incredible. So you either have this, go and bomb and take out Delhi lobby.
So let me introduce you heartthrob of Bollywood.
Or you have go and join Bollywood lobby. In between, I think there's a lot of space where media discourse can take place, does not take place, and that's my beef with Pakistani media.
There's decades of history that weighs on journalists in Pakistan and India. The 1947 partition, the subsequent wars, and the ongoing standoff over Kashmir poisoned the bilateral relationship and twisted perceptions in the media. And there is pressure from above, the two governments.
The Indian government increasingly thinks of Indian media as a way of getting its part of the story out, and the Pakistani government does likewise.
Left-wing extremists.
The media has to understand that regardless of whether you're Indian media or Pakistani media, you cannot be guided simply by one side of the story.
My colleague Manjit Singh Negi has learned from sources in the Indian intelligence establishment.
And this is unfortunately what is happening more and more.
It mirrors what the two governments want to do. If the two governments say, okay, we are going to talk to each other, at once the media will exactly mirror that and will fall into this embrace. And then the minute the two governments fall apart, the media falls apart. And this is the problem. The media is not able to differentiate itself from the state.
News consumers in South Asia looking for something different in the way of coverage do have options online that offer a more balanced perspective. Aman Ki Asha, or Desire for Peace, is a campaign launched in 2010 by two media houses, the Jung Group, Pakistan's largest newspaper publisher, and the Times of India Group, which owns India's biggest-selling English-language daily. Editors from Jung and the Times say their aim is shaping the media discourse and steering it away from rancor and divisiveness. The campaign struggled to make an impact in print, but has since grown online. The website focuses on collaborations between Indians and Pakistanis. It features interviews and articles from both sides of the border and hosts summits and debates in both countries. In India, there are two other websites you can go to for sensible coverage of Indo-Pak issues. There's Kafila, whose tagline is "Run from Big Media," and then there is The Wire, a new venture founded by two former newspaper editors. Over in Pakistan, there are a few prominent people to follow on Twitter for commentary on bilateral affairs. Bina Sarwar is the current Pakistan editor for Aman Ki Asha. There are two other columnists to follow on Twitter, Raza Rumi and Mosharraf Zaidi. Zaidi is a former advisor to the Pakistani Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Finally, time-lapse photography dates back to the 1870s, to a horse racing track in California and a debate over whether all four of a horse's hooves ever leave the ground simultaneously while the horse is trotting or on the gallop. Well, they were unable to tell by the naked eye alone, so a photographer was brought in to settle the issue. And through a series of experiments, time-lapse photography was born, a development that eventually would contribute to the invention of the motion picture. Today, the technique is used to bring landscapes and cityscapes to life, as showcased in this next time-lapse shot in Austria. Photographers Thomas Puchsteiner and Peter Jablonovsky are with the Vienna-based production company called Film Spectacle. And they say that they spent 2 years, shot 600 sequences, and used 5 terabytes of photos on this project. Austria is a picturesque country, and this little video captures that. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.